Let's talk about how companies are moving from dabbling into doing and embracing the full power of AI with business leader Daniel Fricker.
A lot of software platforms were coming out with AI features. You got to think of AI as the new way to work. Preliminary studies have shown is by incorporating some of these more advanced bots and whatnot, you're now able to service customers much more quickly, and the customer satisfaction scores have actually gone up. Big companies, small companies, it's really critical because if you can jump on this sooner rather than later, it can really help your business.
Today, we're talking AI adoption in business. This guy knows his stuff. He just hosted a huge AI workshop at Target Field in Minneapolis yesterday. So we're going to talk through, hey, what did your research before the event show? What happened at the event? And then dive into what businesses of all sizes are doing these days with AI adoption. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what inspired Bases Loaded?
What really inspired it was, well, if you really want to know the genesis, it started where a lot of good things start in a bar. And it started about a year ago because there was a really convergence of things going on in my life, personally, professionally. I've been on the career advisory board at the University of Minnesota within their College of Science and Engineering. So, every year, not only do I get a chance to hang out with a lot of college professors that are bona fides in physics and astrophysics, but then also working with a fair number of people in the industry, people from M to Apple, Medtronic, Honeywell. And then, of course, in my professional life, basically what I have seen within the talent acquisition staffing industry is both directly seeing that a lot of software platforms were coming out with AI features, right? So even just the standard suite of software that, the companies that I work with are using, but then even just, I mean, you started to see things about OpenAI and DeepSeek and whatever. So it was this really funny convergence of people talking about this and in multiple ways that kind of got me really pulled into this. And so I've since picked up a number of AI certifications. And then I was in a bar and someone was like, hey, you really need to, there's a gap here. There's a gap in understanding about what the capabilities are and what it can mean. So not only am I starting to do some podcast about this, but someone offered up the idea of doing a workshop. And then we got some sponsors to invite a number of business leaders within Minneapolis, St. Paul region. And it really varied in times in size of companies. So from Fortune 100 companies to Fortune 250 companies to small to medium sized businesses, businesses that are 10 million to 100 million, all were struggling with this, even the concepts of AI, because of how fast things have evolved in this last year. And quite frankly, how things are evolving even faster as we're kind of peeking into 2026. So that was really kind of the impetus and to get some sponsors to say, like, yeah, let's do a workshop at Target Field where the Minnesota Twins were playing the Cubs and they lost. But yeah, and then we sent out a survey in advance and really got some interesting results. And that really kind of set the stage for the day, to really have, some really interesting conversations about AI.
Can you walk us through what you found most interesting in the results from that survey?
Yeah, I think what was interesting. Okay, so we already talked about the size of the companies that some of these folks were coming from, but you had people from HR, you had people from IT, we had people responsible for R&D departments, right? So there really wasn't even a consistency in terms of like, functional areas, right? So with that context, almost all participants really had a hands-on curiosity, or in some cases had already started to apply some AI pilots inside their organizations. But I think the universal truth was everyone was just getting started. I think the other thing that I thought was actually very encouraging is that AI was already being used across different functions. So IT departments were using it, HR, sales, R&D, marketing, were all using, AI. But I mean, far and away, the top concern was really around data security and privacy. And that actually really got unpacked in several ways during the workshop. But I think the last piece was really kind of an acknowledgement that, you know, attendees acknowledged that their understanding of AI, although was starting, there is they want to accelerate more pilot projects. They wanted to accelerate more learnings in terms of real practical applications of what that can look like and feel like.
As someone who's worked with companies of all sizes, do you predict that someone who's got a huge company and more resources is going to be able to adopt AI quicker? Or do you think that the red tape at those larger companies might make it even harder to do widespread adoption?
So I have to credit Paul Canetti. He was actually our keynote speaker. In addition to owning his own business, he's also a professor at Columbia. So I guess to answer your question, this is the way Paul would have kind of framed this out, right? So there's really three ways to look at AI today, right? You got to think of AI as the new way to work, right? So in this particular concept, what a lot of organizations are seeing, and I'll use this from an IT example perspective. So if you had 10 developers, right? AI and some of these new AI tools really give a company a choice. Do we want to save money on cost, right? Or do we want to potentially increase the revenue, of the company? And I'll give you examples here. If you've determined that AI can improve the efficiency of your 10 developers by, let's just say 80%, well, that gives you a choice. Either do you eliminate, 8 out of the 10 people, and so you're still making the same amount of money, but you're saving 80%, or do you keep the same, 10 people and increase your sales to 5 million, 6 million, whatever, you know, and that is again where it comes down to a business choice. I think even in the context of like HR, for example, there are tools today that allow candidates to submit a lot more resumes. There's these tools that do a lot better job in terms of being able to categorize workers, like essentially rank them for all intents and purposes. But I will tell you, like, we even got some demonstrations. In fact, I'll give you a funny example. If you actually go to the Domino's pizza site,
Okay.
if you want to understand how AI has evolved in terms of how it can communicate with you, we started playing with the AI app for Domino's Pizza, in which we were asking questions. And like in the responses you were getting, you were convinced it was a human being on the other end, right? So think of it from an HR perspective where instead of doing your first candidate pre-screening, you're now having AI do that for you. So now you've got the human beings kind of moving over, right? So thinking of AI right now as a new way to work, that's one aspect. But then we just touched on the second aspect, which is AI as a customer platform, right? So think of it this way, like the Domino's example, where, who hasn't been frustrated by being shoved into call trees, and you want to just get to an operator? What the preliminary studies have shown is by incorporating some of these more advanced bots and whatnot, you're now able to service customers much more quickly. And the customer satisfaction scores have actually gone up using kind of the traditional means, the phone trees and everything else, which I think everyone is, kind of done with. The third concept, and this is kind of a little bit more of the real future sense, is AI is the new electricity. So, we think back to what it was like during the turn of, the previous century, where literally we were going from, gas powered lamps to actual using electricity to power our homes and whatnot, and not using coal or wood or whatever. You know, we are knocking on the door quite literally by the end of this decade, right? So think about your refrigerator. You now have Wi-Fi enabled refrigerators, right? That's connected to, the internet and everything else. Now you're literally going to have more and more products in which instead of you telling, yes, I want to get, more milk, and actually making a conscious engagement with either your refrigerator or an Alexa to do this, it's doing it automatically for you. So the same ways that Waze is telling you how to get from point A to point B automatically, because Waze is actually pinging, all the Department of Motor Vehicles, whatever kind of transit, software. So it's rerouting you in real time. Now imagine walking into a room with your lights or your refrigerator, or all these kind of different examples. where it's just now becoming ubiquitous. It's becoming automatic. So those are huge kind of concepts I think that people were kind of wrestling with in the room of moving even just beyond AI is the new way to work.
We had a prep call. This is for the listeners. We had a prep call a few weeks ago, and I was pausing and my jaw was dropping with some. You tell the stories so well that they're relatable. Even the bit about, so if you're in a company, you can see all three different things applying to your company, to applying to you and your personal life. Like when you're calling a customer service line, how does it feel for you? How do you want it to feel for the future of your company? This is all awesome. So three different ways you guys were looking at AI. What else did you learn from the pre-screen survey that stood out?
I think the thing that number one that came out was data security. And I think, again, trying to use the crystal ball to kind of predict the future here. I'm old enough to remember that, as you're kind of going in and out of the 90s, you had servers in the basements of most businesses. Didn't matter if you were a restaurant or a big corporation, you had your own servers, right? And then was with the advent of cloud or the cloud, you know, people really kind of struggled with the idea of like, oh, wait, I can physically see that server in the room. I know it's protected, right? I've got all the necessary things. I can even like physically see it. And,
I've got
so the,
stuck on the page.
yeah, exactly. So this idea of saying, okay, I'm just going to take all the data information that and just kind of put it somewhere in this kind of, but people got beyond it, right? Because I think there were, you have heavily regulated industries, doesn't matter if it's banking or certainly healthcare with HIPAA and whatnot. Like there's true implications if things like customer data gets out there. One of the things that people were talking about in real time is that they want to use more AI and AI tools, but they're really, concerned about, okay, what does this mean from a data privacy perspective, protecting? But the reality is that, the data within AI is actually plots in, these data centers. So in some cases, it's in the general, internet cloud itself, but in some cases, it's really kind of in a self-protected state. One of the things that Paul was kind of talking about is if these patterns are true, more and more people are just going to get more and more comfortable with their data just being into that AI environment, right? Now, you also are going to see some bumps along the way for sure. But I think, likely people are going to get over it. And I think you do have to be conscious, especially in regulated markets, about again what is going in and what is going out of that data stream, right? So it'd be completely irresponsible for an organization to like take real healthcare data and just kind of throw it into the cloud. So you still need to have these type of controls, but you shouldn't prevent you from going forward just because you're fearful of data security. It's the same argument that people had going from client servers to cloud. So that was probably, again, a huge concern because now going back to that next piece, I'll even give you some examples in the room, right? So you had a plumber, a guy that owned a plumbing company, and he was basically saying, look, I'm a small business. He's like, but I have some of the best ratings in the Twin Cities providing plumbing services, right? He's like, I can tell you the differences between Minneapolis homes and St. Paul homes based on kind of, how they're plumbing. I mean, he's been in business for quite some time. He's like, I can't figure out for the life of me how I can actually get my little small to medium sized business to be even the top five search if I were to Google best plumbers in the Twin Cities. And, of course, when you have an AI expert, it's going, yeah, okay, I can help you compete and help, kind of an algorithm create an AI agent or a bot to basically help bolster your business. And on the spot, he's like, I need a workshop with you right now. Let's do it.
Even
So,
traditional search is all it's so fast.
right.
How much it's all changing.
We talked about, examples, people that are small businesses. Maybe they own a couple of homes that they use via Airbnb. You can now have AI systems that use surge pricing the same way that the Hiltons, the Hyatts of the worlds do it. So if, baseball games in town or if it's a certain time of year, take those same type of advanced algorithms that they've had access to for decades, but apply it to that small business. And I think that was kind of a huge shocking result for a lot of people in the room going, this isn't for just big companies. As a matter of fact, you kind of have almost a bimodal distribution of big businesses, right? You have some big businesses that are going big time into AI, right? Publicly, I mean, companies like JP Morgan Chase have talked about massive, massive investments that they're making within AI. And by the way, a lot of it to help run their business more efficiently, right? So, I mean, thousands of people that are actually just doing that to help run their business. So that they've gone in big time. There was some controversy if you saw just a week ago, and not sure when this podcast comes out, but Shopify's CEO came out with a directive and it kind of made the news in a negative way. But I don't necessarily know if it's negative because the CEO came out to say, before I approve any additional hiring of people, I need you to essentially go through this exercise. And he laid it out pretty clearly, this exercise of saying, how are you applying some of these AI tools? And he gave some examples. Have you gone through this before you just add another person? And there were a lot of people that got upset by this, but I'll tell you what that shows me. You have a leadership team that understands the value of AI. You have a person that's basically said, we've made significant investments in this area and these tools are in front of you. Are you actually using them? Are you looking for new ways to work before you just hire a person to come on board? So I think those are the kind of examples that we really kind of got into, big companies, small companies. And I think it's really critical because if you can jump on this sooner rather than later, it can really help your business.
For both size companies, I'm thinking of this bing, bing, bing question. Okay, this is great. We have this new tool, but I'm already doing a day job. Like, how am I going to also? So, for the plumber, I'm already running the business. How am I going to also learn this whole AI thing? Maybe he's also learning how to do social media content. It feels like you have to learn all these new things. How are you learning these new things and keeping up with your day job? Same with a big company. You've got, we're not hiring anybody else. You're going to do more work and we're expecting you to get really efficient really quickly. How are they learning how to leverage the AI?
So I think we broke this down into a couple of different parts, but I think this is also applicable to big companies and small companies. I think one of the biggest takeaways, in fact, I'm happy to report, I would say well over half the attendees essentially approached us to say, we would actually like to go into more of an in-depth, like 6 hour plus type of framework building exercise. Right. So even Paul Canetti was talking about let's just all say we've agreed that AI can help drive our business better. Now let's go through an exercise around practical applications within your business. How do you start building, kind of think of a hydra, if multiple AI projects. And then how do you also make sure that you go beyond just basic awareness, but how do you actually build in some training and upskilling? There was a person in the room from that I don't want to mention her by name, but it was definitely a recognizable large manufacturing company. And she was actually talking about how they just started this journey with training. And what was interesting in their initial findings was the people that need the most training were actually the legacy managers, the ones that had been with the company, 15, 20, 30 years. And she was pleasantly surprised that it was, the newer employees, the recent college grads and whatever, were much more, further down the path. And what this company was basically trying to say is, okay, so we've thought through where we want to have practical applications. We thought through some frameworks, but now you also have to sprinkle a little bit of that change management 101, right? Let's be honest, that's been an age-old human problem for centuries. How do you change what you're currently doing? But I guess the good news is that when you have executive leadership, when you have leaders inside that organization, like the owner of that plumbing company, that's like, look, I see where this can drive change. I need to help kind of forge ahead and really kind of force the company in this direction. Same thing with Shopify CEO. I think when you start to kind of, pull back and say like, scary, not sure, I'll dress this at a different day. That's when you can find yourself potentially getting really lapped by this new technology.
Do you think that there could be a benefit in having a grace period where you keep hiring as if you don't have AI and you give people less to do so that they can do all these adoption techniques that you're talking about?
I think it depends, right? One thing that Paul said that I truly agreed with, any position with that involves hands, this is an opportunity to do those type of jobs more. So if you're talking about a plumber, right? I mean, they're clearly using their hands and everything else, but there's ways to help that plumber grow their business, do in effect better a job in terms of managing their business. If you're talking about salespeople, how do you get people to shake more hands, right? What's really been interesting is that with AI, and I think there's several factors that's probably leading to this, post COVID, we're only communicating via video, that type of thing. Like people, surveys after surveys are showing that people want more and more interactions, like human touch, authentic interactions, right? So I think one thing that, Paul was challenged in the room is, if you're doing this right and doing it well, you're improving those human connections because AI can give you better authenticity. If you're a salesperson, what are you doing in terms of research, not just on the company, but the person you're meeting with, right? Those are tools that would have been a godsend 20 years ago, to anyone in sales. It's the same thing in marketing. One of the things that this plumber, can't believe I keep going back to the plumber, but he's like, I don't know a thing about interacting with my customers. Is there a way to help me improve that? Of course there is. So I think that's, if people just keep thinking about maybe not necessarily as a threat, but how do you kind of improve that human touch and authenticity, it can really be a benefit. Or another thing is, are there specific burning questions? I'll give you an example here. A lot of organizations, or maybe even in your own life, like think of like maybe technology that you've tried to adopt and it just didn't work, right? And it could have been a product, it could have been a software, whatever. And you might have disregarded ever using technology in that type of capacity again. And I think as we were wrapping up, and this kind of goes directly to Paul's second point around AI as a customer platform. I'll give you some interesting data before I kind of go forward on this. Are you a fan of Reddit?
I just started using it and I like it.
So Reddit's data is growing so fast that it's like recreating Wikipedia every day. Yeah. There was a chart that he showed, which is how fast did it take Instagram to get to 100 million users? It was about 3 years, right? How fast did it take ChatGPT to get 100 million users? It was 2 weeks.
Oh,
So when I say that, when you first had this kind of these machine learning tools, what people don't fully understand is now you've got AI that's able to connect to the internet, able to connect to things like BuzzFeed or, you know, the National Weather Service. So it's using its own data, but able to ping via APIs, whatnot, other type of data, right? So suddenly things that you thought in the past, there's no way software or kind of a solution would ever help me in this regard. You need to kind of look at those kind of burning questions again and maybe reapproach it. And there's so many contexts and examples I can use, but I think when people kind of see how fast this is moving, and you're going to see more organizations like DeepSeek that came out of nowhere and are able to create AI that is much more maybe bespoke by country, by industry. I mean, that's really what you're seeing is kind of this taken off in such a way that our conversation today, even 6 months from now, is going to sound probably pretty old.
we'll try to keep up. We'll do a repost. I know people who are doing panels on, and you probably felt this going into yesterday, people who are sitting on panels or doing podcasts about AI say, every week I have to refresh and check the news and make sure that what I'm saying is true because it's changing so quickly.
Well, I'll give you an example there. So there was another person that heads up an R&D department, and he and Paul almost had kind of a breakout conversation around saying, hey, For me, one of the most time consuming things is to look at the latest research that's coming out in whatever type of, field and whatnot. But we're talking about like bona fide, like proper, like research coming out of Harvard or Stanford or, whatever. He's like, is there a way to create a system that can be very bespoke right there on the spot? Paul did it in front of him. And he created, so like, I'll give you another example of how quickly AI has evolved. 3, 4 years ago, you might be able to put a 400 character prompt, and then AI would kind of run off and do its own things. With some of these current versions, you can put 10 million characters. So you can literally put prompts that are pages and pages long. And so that's exactly what Paul was doing, was to say, I just built you something right here in the room that is going to actively ping all these major universities and whatnot, so that every day you can wake up and see what are the top ranked published papers that are coming out. It's just learning that these tools can do it, and you can be off to the races.
I've seen a lot of posts and articles that say, all right, boomers and millennials, AI isn't just searching in ChatGPT, which is what I use it for mostly. But what kind of upskilling could an individual or a team do just to get confident using AI in their work life?
I think, there's a couple different ways to kind of think about it. I think anyone that is looking at some of the bigger tools that are out there, right? And so I'm talking about, Gemini. It's going to be funny to say this because again, 6 months ago, this is probably going to change. But Gemini, of course, is Google's product. Perplexity is one of my personal favorites and whatnot. Most of these tools are doing a better job at trying to at least train the user, right? So they're starting to kind of create templates that, and so my first recommendation is, it's almost like pick a tool. I'll pick one of the major tools, but let's just pick a tool. I'll pick on Perplexity. You can start looking at what some of these prompts are or some of these templates. And then the next thing I would say is start getting into prompt engineering. When I say prompt engineering, it's about like, think of a question that you want to ask for your business. So, I am a plumber located in Minneapolis, and I'm looking to create a database of like, you start writing this out. In the past, you would have to, do your own programming and everything else, but you start writing out that paragraph. It's going to be 10 million characters. You can write out pages. And then you put it into the tool to say, build me a website, build me a custom CRM system, build me a marketing plan, whatever kind of outcomes you want it to do. And you can actually start to really build out things that might have taken months or even years to build within hours, if not days. Right. And so a lot of these tools, it's really that basic front end. Listen, when I was in grad school, I had to do some basic programming because I have a master's in human resources and industrial relations, but specifically was in HR analytics, right? So the fact that I have some basic understandings of like codes like Python and whatnot, but now with prompt engineering, I can get my own mom to actually probably do as good of prompt engineering that I can do, and then let AI do all the heavy lifting. But you also have to think about something else about what AI and how it works. And I think this was also kind of a fundamental thing. And I'll use the example. In fact, the actual example in the room was, if you were to ask AI right now, Mary has a little, what's the next word?
Can I say it? Or are we waiting for
Yeah,
it? Lamb.
right, exactly. What they found though was about 6 to 7 out of 10 times it was lamb. And then what would come up is, Mary has a little problem. Mary has a little, because what it was doing, it was literally pinging every example of that sentence. And basically, AI is a probability machine. So basically, what you're saying is 6 to 7 times out of 10, the answer is going to be lamb. But think of it as like rolling the dice. So 1 out of 4 times, it's going to say problem. That's one reason why one of the other things when you build these prompts and tools is sometimes asking the same tool or different tools the same question. Because from a probability perspective, you might get slightly different answers. And that's not a wrong thing if you understand kind of what it's doing and why it's doing it that way.
If you started in, say you use Perplexity or you use ChatGPT and you're just using it for search today, could you put in a prompt like, hey, build me a 30-minute, a course I can finish in 30 minutes that teaches me how to best prompt you? Can it teach you how to use it?
Yeah.
That's fun.
Literally, you could literally use the tool to help train you on the tool. So, yeah.
All right. Well, okay. Now we have some guidelines to just dip our toes in a little bit more and more personally, and then as our companies are working on the bigger projects. We talked about security, and you said, trust it. It's okay. This is cloud computing 2.0. How do you feel about policies and ethics and the role of AI there?
So this is tough because even at the best of times, you have seen legislation and laws really lagging behind where the technology in the world is going. So the EU, for example, passed a law that went into effect on January 1st of 2025. And part of that AI law had some very specific components around hiring practices, basically saying that organizations need to, if they're using certain tools, right? So there's things called applicant tracking software tools or ATS tools. You need to have someone essentially create some policies around making sure that the machine isn't having an adverse impact on women, on certain religions, and whatever, just religion, that sort of thing. I'm not as familiar with employment laws in Europe, but generally speaking, they reflect the US, right? So, is there bias? And then number two, document what are you doing to help remediate those biases? Because, AI companies have known since the first paper published you know, that the tool basically is using data. So if a company has been doing unfair hiring practices, which they may or may not even be aware of,
Mhm.
it's just going to keep repeating it and sometimes even make it worse, right? In fact, Professor Andrew Nigg, who is with Stanford, that was part of the original Google Mind initiative. He discovered this in one of the first years when he published this paper in 2016. In fact, how he knew it was, and he uses the example, when he asked the machine, what is the profile of a best software developer? And it was basically saying the best software developer is a man. And he's, well, what about women? They're good homemakers. He's like, we got a problem. But again, that's not necessarily the tool's fault, which is why you constantly have to be looking at it. So the EU has actually said, define your practices. How are you using the tools? And are you auditing yourself to make sure if you're discovering these problems, what are you doing to change it? In the US right now, I think there's 7 states with different types of laws that are in progress. At a federal level, the United States has basically said, we're not looking at this, at least for the foreseeable, right? So I think that onus now falls on individual states and individual companies to make sure that they actually have policies and ethics, so they don't inadvertently, or in some cases, you have a department level, like intentionally create really adverse impact because we still have laws in the US like the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We've had, the Americans with Disability Act. We've had, subsequent, rules and regulations around unfair hiring practices. So that's, you can't do it with reckless abandon for sure, but it's going to be probably another year or two before you start seeing kind of, at least in the US, broad AI specific legislation. Whereas in other parts of the world, they're a little bit further down the road on this.
Hmm. In terms of the ethics of using AI to be more efficient in your job, maybe it's not something that your boss is like, hey, use this tool and you'll get more efficient. But you think, hey, if I do it this way, I'll get my job done in 4 hours. What are the ethics of, do I have to stay for 8 hours or can I go sit outside?
Well, here's what I will tell you, and I'll use it from a education perspective. So you have right now, there are very few universities that have a consistent AI policy. And I got to witness this firsthand, where if you have a department that basically like astrophysics, that's saying like, look, we're astrophysicists, we're not coders. I'm fine using AI to do the programming. And then you have the computer science department going, whoa, like, we've got a problem with this. So I think when it comes to ethics, again, I think this goes back to how I started the conversation with this needs to come down from leadership. They need to set some real clear guidelines around best practices. They need to clear guidelines to say our policy and ethics organizationally have not changed as it relates to how we're treating each other, how we're handling intellectual property. But I'll give you another example, Chelsea. Here's the thing. There are patents, there are proprietary software that people have. A great example would be TikTok. TikTok has an algorithm that is amazing, right? And it is hugely proprietary with them. So if you're building something for your own personal use, like, the example with like Perplexity, that's fine. But if you're a business and you're building and encoding things in AI, and there is potentially proprietary code that you might not even know is proprietary, but it's still proprietary, you can find yourself in some real legal risk because essentially you're ripping off someone's IP without giving them credit. Now, the good news is a good ethical company, there are tools out there that will look for that type of code and basically say, hey, listen, you've got some exposure here, and then of course you can, either obviously do it ethically, reach out to that organization, pay the licensing fee, and, all is good with the world, or you alter the code so you're not running afoul. Again, what I think to your point, if the reality is employees are doing it anyway. In fact, statistically speaking, the younger employees are probably doing it even more than the older employees, on average, all things being equal. So again, don't turn away, get in front of it. Because if you put your head in the sand, it's only going to get further, it's only going to get worse. And everyone's going to be looking to leadership to say, what is our policy here? And I think that's the other call to action that we heard loud and clear in the room. It needs to come top down.
Seems like there's so many different areas we touched on. We touched on how to grow faster and make your team more efficient, legal ramifications and things you need to be thinking about, security, ethics, hiring practices. There are a lot of different pieces, which is probably why all the different departments are dabbling in different ways. As a leader, should you hire a firm or what should you do to get started or to keep going with AI across the board?
Okay, so here's some good news. There are a number of great companies out there that provide, the necessary upskilling to move beyond these kind of dabbling pilots. In fact, I would say, and I have no problem, mentioning them by name, but Emeritus was a company that was a major sponsor. They've been providing upskilling and retraining for decades, and they're a nationally recognized organization, and they've done it with some of the biggest companies out there. So the good news is there are reputable companies that allow for that type of upskilling, stuff that's right off the shelf, if you will. And then there are a number of reputable, organizations, we can talk about a couple of them that I think it's really critical that this needs to probably go on the dashboard of any owner, any executive, which is to say, look, we don't necessarily need to build out this extensive AI, strategy per se, but we definitely need to build out a framework, right? What are kind of think of like the bylaws, if you will, in terms of how we want to, promote scaling AI projects in our company with some of these critical elements. So if you have executive leadership buy-in, if you create a framework around kind of what are some of these burning platforms or issues that we want to address. And by the way, I think that's another key thing too. The best ideas aren't coming from the IT department. The best ideas are coming from the functional heads, where you're having people in marketing saying, how do I do this better? Or sales or finance, being able to kind of allow for that dialogue to start happening in a truly framework way. I would say over the last 5 months, I'm becoming more and more passionate that that is really the best way build on the lessons from others that have failed.
That's great. And by the time someone listens to this, there might be new lessons.
And there will be. There absolutely will be, which is why you have to also make it dynamic.
What's next for your team? You just wrapped up this workshop yesterday. What's next for your team coming out of that?
Well, I can tell you there is a strong interest to actually have a much more dedicated workshop So, a lot of the people that came to the event, and there were a couple of exceptions, again, they were leaders within their department. They now want to bring in multiple people from their department. So they want to, again, we just talked about it a second ago, go beyond just kind of dabbling and experimenting. They want to actually start going through some of these framework exercises. So for some of the larger companies, they want to do that privately. What was interesting though was with some of the smaller companies, they were saying, hey, can maybe we pull some of these resources and do a workshop and with, kind of some of these smaller businesses that, you know, maybe you're talking about a smaller scale, less people, but potentially have a much greater impact in terms of how they're running their business. So it's barely 24 hours since our event, but I think as we were kind of leaving the room and well into the evening, kind of mapping out kind of what some of these next steps are, I think is probably one of the few times in which I've done a workshop only to have these kind of breakout, workshops happen afterward with such a wide ranging set of people. So that's what's the horizon and what's next is kind of building this community and peer learning group that are really doing some really cool things with these new tools.
What would be one thing you'd want someone who's listening who maybe is in this dabble phase to walk away from this episode with?
When I say that it's coming out daily, right? There are exponentially more examples by industry, by function of how companies are starting to use AI to drive productivity, right? So even in preparation for today, I think you might have referenced in the past, like the perfectionist guide to losing control.
Yes.
Actually loved a lot of that book because I think so many people want perfection when they're thinking about AI. And I think people get uncomfortable. It's like, no, this is a little bit more nebulous, right? And it's okay to not have this perfect control over it. But, I think the more people start to kind of see examples of how it's being used across industries, and how you're starting to build better frameworks and about how you're going in with a mindset of, guys, this is a new way to do work. The way we used to do it, you know, it's just not going to cut it anymore for our business, for our organization. And then, of course, how do you make sure you do it with all the policy ethics and, IP protections that make your company unique? So I think it's not just one thing, but it's almost like I don't know how you get away from this. McKinsey says that 75% of all jobs are going to be directly impacted with AI and AI tools. With those odds, I mean, I don't know how you can continue to just say, I'm just not going to do anything with it. It's going to pull you in the same way that I witnessed my parents go through. I don't need the internet. I don't need anything more than dial up. And now I think they're on the internet more than I am. So like, I think that's we've seen this before. It's always this kind of uncomfortable period before we kind of get to that new acceptance phase.
I'm excited for after the acceptance phase kinda gets there because that's when everyone's like, "Okay, it's not scary," and then you can start creatively having a little more fun with it across the board. Just think of what MySpace turned into for all of us.
Okay. I want to make another example, Chelsea, because, when I first got my iPhone and we were talking about many moons ago, like shortly after, Steve Jobs held it up, like, do you remember when people were like, what's an app? And remember, like, one of the hottest apps was like, it looked like it was beer and you can drink from it.
Your phone turned into the cup.
Yes. Right. And we thought that was a cool app, you know, not even thinking for a second what an Amazon app would do or a Netflix app would do. I mean, we're kind of in the iPhone looks like a beer face.
Snake. We thought Snake was a good game, and it was. It was.
Minesweeper.
And what's the one, Snood, where you shot the heads? Anyways, yeah.
Yeah. No, but I mean, within our, recent lifetime, like we've seen this before. And I think you apply those same type of, let's just say patterns to say, like, this is probably how AI is going to evolve.
Well, this is all very exciting. I am glad to hear that the event went so well. I look forward to hearing about the follow-up workshops and what you guys continue to learn. I'm going to post your links down below so people can follow you. Yeah. So it's not just a technical future, this AI thing. It's going to be a little bit personal, a little bit fun. There are going to be ethics. And I'm going to be following you to make sure that I keep up with it all.
Please do.
Thank you so much for coming on.